Well, let's share a word of prayer. Gracious and glorious God, we give you thanks for this day that you've given to us. And we pray, O Lord, that throughout our comings and our goings, we may find ourselves being vital witnesses to your love wherever we may go. We ask now that you allow us to set aside some time to come together and to feast on your word. Grant that as we look through this Gospel of John, that indeed we might find ourselves understanding better your call on our lives, that you will fill us with the power of your Holy Spirit, and that you will send us as your people. For we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
I want to begin first, I want to pass this around. One of the things that we'll come across in the Gospel of John is the 7 signs in the Gospel of John, the 7 signs that points to the Messiahship of Christ. And so I printed those out so we know in a little bit in advance what we're kind of looking at for the 7 signs. And as we turn to the Gospel of John, I'm going to ask Doris if you would turn to Genesis chapter 1 and read the first 3 words.
In the beginning.
In the beginning.
In the beginning. Now turn to John 1 and what are the first 3 words?
I'm going to say, can I guess?
That gives us a major clue as to what John's intent hopes to be. That in the beginning in Genesis, the world was created ex nihilo, or out of nothing. Ex nihilo. But was also created out of chaos. And in the creation story, there is the separation of day and night, or light and dark. And in the Gospel of John, we have imagery to the light and to darkness, not necessarily focusing on the period out of the 24-hour day when it's light and when it's dark, but that those who have not come to know God through Jesus live in the darkness. The dark is oftentimes associated with evil or lack of understanding. We think in the dark, it's easy to bump into things and it's hard to find where you're going. So it's people without direction. And the Gospel of John, it begins with this idea of in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that word that translates from logos essentially is an understanding that in the beginning Jesus always was. That a form of Jesus was, not necessarily, not earthly Jesus, but Jesus or the Christ in heaven was all existing, and that it was through him that God made things occur. So that logos, that word, is seen as the light, and John the Baptist comes along to announce that Jesus, or that the light, is coming into the world. and that it's important for the people to recognize this. And as we know from the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the synoptic gospels. And the reason they call them that is because they basically are a synopsis of the life of Jesus. They're in biographical form. John is a little different than that. But in the introduction to the Gospel of John, we have John the Baptist coming onto the scene and announcing that we should be aware that someone is bringing new understanding, new light into the world. And he goes on to say, then, John goes on to say, that the Word became flesh. Now, and this is a reference to the birth story, even though the birth story really isn't spelled out in John. But that the Word became flesh and dwelled among us. Or I like Eugene Peterson's interpretation or translation, where he said the Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. So that's one of the things that I think helps maybe to put forth that this Word becoming flesh wasn't something that was a separate entity, but that it came to be with us and was, in a way, an invasion into our world, which many people cherish, and there are those that didn't, certainly. And John was the one who was witnessing to this light that was coming into the world, that was to provide the means by which all of us could experience God's grace. As we talked about in the Wesley study, those of us with an understanding of free will recognize that God can offer things to us in Jesus, and it's up to us to choose whether we take them or reject them and move on, and I would say be willing to accept whatever consequences come because of our decisions when it comes to that. But anyway, the remainder of the first chapter, the bulk of the first chapter, deals with John the Baptist and his message. And also, I think it's really important that in the story about John the Baptist, one of the things we see taking place is John comes on the scene and develops a certain amount of popularity among the people. He's baptizing and he gets a pretty good audience. He has disciples who follow him around. And then as he comes to announce that Christ is coming into the world, he intentionally knows that he needs to step back a little bit. And he loses some disciples to Jesus, but he's not mad about it, because he understands that his role is coming to a different point, that he had his 15 minutes of fame, and now it's up to him to stand back. And one of the lessons that many years ago it was, I preached a sermon on John the Baptist stepping back, and raised the idea of all of us may at times feel ourselves in that position where for a moment in time we really get a lot of attention, or the focus is on us, but then we need to know when to pull back. We need to be able to say, as John did, that the salvation story wasn't about him. The salvation story is about Jesus, and it's not about any of the other characters. I cannot receive salvation because Doris says I should, right? We have to lift up the gift of that salvation. As he calls his disciples towards the end of chapter 1 in verse 43 and following, Philip finds Nathanael, and he says to him, "We found the Messiah. This is what we're looking for." And Nathanael's response is the classic, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Or bang.
Yeah.
Yeah. That might even be more realistic. When we think of it, Nazareth, it wasn't a major city. It wasn't a city of philosophers and pedagons. It was a backwater town, and at best, the most skilled people would have been artisans like Joseph, who was in the Greek was a tekton, which is kind of it's not a carpenter. It's more like a woodworker, a cabinet maker, we might call them in today's age. And that would have been considered pretty hoity-toity for the people in Nazareth. Most people did what they could to make a subsistence living in Nazareth, but you never would expect anything significant to come out of it. So Nathanael is not being rude, he's being practical. How can this be? As if I go back, let's go back to the 70s, when Jimmy Carter came on the scene, the peanut farmer from Georgia. And it was like, where the heck did he come from? The same holds true. Jesus comes out, where did he come from? How is this all fitting together? The Jews, again, were waiting for the Messiah, but not Jesus. They were looking for someone who would be more like King David, powerful, militaristic, somebody who was going to take on the Roman Empire and squash them like a bug. Not somebody who came out of Nazareth with seemingly no authority or power or any gifts of leadership whatsoever. So with that's kind of the prologue to John, is this introduction of the Word being present with God at the time of creation, the Word becoming flesh and living in the world, John the Baptist introducing us to the character of Jesus and his meaning, then John stepping back to allow Jesus to step up. And even with that, with the calling of the disciples, some hesitation on the part of some to see Jesus as the Messiah. One of the things that holds true in the Gospel of John that's different than the synoptics of Matthew, Mark, and Luke is in John makes the attempt to let us know that Jesus is the Messiah, where in the synoptics we often have what's called the messianic secret of Jesus would do things, miracles, and then he'd tell his disciples not to tell anybody. As if there was, the agendas are kind of different. John is very much overt in, hey, here's Jesus, look at who he is, come to accept him. As you look at the end of the Gospel of John, he writes that one of the reasons he's telling these stories is so that you will believe. He's not suggesting that we have to somehow decipher all this language and story that are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke and be able to come to a conclusion. He tells us what the conclusion's supposed to be in John.
Can I ask, since we're at the end of chapter 1, and you just used the word decipher, this last paragraph, where he's telling Nathaniel, I tell you the truth, you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. I think when I read the Bible and I see something like that, I visualize that's what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
But as I read, I look down here in the study Bible, that's not going to be a physical thing. Nathaniel isn't going to actually see that. Do I understand?
Well, one of the things, the differences again between the Synoptic Gospels and John, the Synoptic Gospels tend to present everything as being kind of factual and understanding. John deals a lot with imagery. So when I read that, the first thing that comes to my mind is Jacob's ladder.
They refer to that too, yeah.
And that's one of the things that, okay, Jacob saw this in a dream. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't a physically happening event. Is it the same type of thing in the Gospel of John, where we're to imagine what this might be like, but yes, we're not going to physically see it.
I wonder how many things I read in the Bible that I take out of context because I'm picturing it physically instead of.
Well, you bring up a really good point about reading the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to read the Bible all literally or all metaphorically. Or all hyperbole, whatever it may be. It's in order to gain the essence of what's being said, we have to try to benefit from the fact that in other reading material, things are presented in different genres. If I'm reading a mystery book, it may be complete fiction. It may be based on some sort of kind of event that took place, or it may be specifically about that event. One of the areas where this came up in religion was folks who were taking the Da Vinci Code literally. And it wasn't written as a literal book. And we can be careful when we read to ask ourselves the question, am I looking at this as historical fact? Or am I looking at this as metaphor? Or am I looking at this as the writer making an attempt to tell me things that the mind just can't comprehend?
So, what is Jesus actually saying to Nathaniel? That Nathaniel's faith is going to be so great that is it more of a comparison to seeing the heavens open and seeing angels ascending and descending?
One of the things that John is attempting to do, I think, is to connect heaven and earth with less separation than how it's described in the book of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, there is heaven and there is earth, two separate entities. I think John is directing us to try to understand that these entities are more intertwined than what Genesis would project. For example, when we pray, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, we're not praying that in heaven the things of earth be done. We're asking that on earth the things of heaven come and be part of our being. And obviously we get hung up with that because, one, it's hard to necessarily interpret what are the things of heaven. That it's debatable. I can take virtually any opinion I might have, and I can project it on being the will of heaven. If I'm not careful, I make God into a white, middle-aged, middle-class, heterosexual male who's a capitalist and believes in democracy and and I can make God in my image instead of trying to be made in God's image, because I just don't understand. I can't get my hands around God's image, right? When heaven invades earth, when it intertwines with us, sometimes it's hard to recognize that it's occurred. I don't, for most of my time, I don't sit around saying, well, that was heavenly. Maybe if somebody bakes me a nice pie, I might say that's heavenly. But it's just hard to identify, I think. But I think the idea is that in John, there's a coming together of heaven and earth. And that coming together was done through the Word becoming flesh. I don't know if that's helpful or not. I think some of these passages we just kind of struggle with the language they're using.
Something that was put in the Bible here. It's called Jesus the Word. John used language with special meaning for both Greek and Jewish readers. In Greek philosophy, word, logos, was a key term, often referring to the power of reason, undergirding all creation. For Jews, too, word had great significance, for God spoke his word to create the world and to transform his people. Yet John's meaning passed beyond the Greek and Jewish ideas. An 8-year-old girl expressed it well when asked why Jesus was Jesus is all God wanted to say to us.
Hey, that's pretty cool. That's really neat. And moving on to chapter 2, then we have the first of the 7 signs. And again, there are tricky parts in this story about the wedding at Cana of Galilee. The wedding at Cana of Galilee passage is often thought of when we think of weddings in general. You know, that Jesus blessed the wedding at Cana in Galilee by his presence and by his miracle of turning water into wine. It is the fodder of many a meme and many a joke where the man is pulled over by the state police and says, "What are you, I'm drinking water," and the state policeman takes a swig and says, "That's wine," and the man says, "Well, he did it again, didn't he?" But anyway, when we look at this, Jesus first and foremost is understood as a social being. He's invited to a wedding and he goes. He doesn't crash the wedding. He doesn't just show up and hope he's invited. He is invited to the wedding and he attends along with his mother. His mother must have been his +1 for that event. And his mother, at this point, Mary, knows more about what Jesus can do than maybe we give her credit for. Because when they run out of wine, her first comment is that Jesus should do something about it. Now, think of yourself, you're invited to a wedding, and you're sitting around your table, you know, waiting for the couple to come and greet you and share nice things, and somebody says to you, "There's no more water in the pitcher, go get some." Well, you know, you're waiting for the waitress or somebody to come around to refill the water jug. It's not like somebody has the right to tell you that all of a sudden you're going from being a guest to being a servant. You know? Well, this is where Jesus is at. You know, he's there as a guest. He's not there to save the day. And put yourself in the position, as we've all been in at times.
But doesn't his mother put him in the position when she tells the servants, whatever he tells
Yes.
you to do,
Yep.
do it?
She raises him up. And as she raises him up, one of the things that her instructions are is not only does she tell him that there's a problem, but she tells the servants who don't even work for her, this is what you're supposed to do. So there's a lot of trust going on in this situation where if I'm the wedding planner and there are guests at the wedding and there's something going on, and next thing you know, the mother-in-law from hell comes up to me and starts complaining about something. Well, maybe that's something that, because I'm paid staff, I need to do something about. But Mary doesn't have authority over the wine stewards. She doesn't work for the company. And the wine stewards have bosses ahead of them who they report to. So there's a little bit of convoluted stuff going on here. But I guess maybe in order just to cut to the chase and get to it, Jesus first objects to what Mary tells him. He says, my time has not yet come. Another way of saying, this really isn't any of my business. But at the same time, he's obedient to his mother. And so she really intrudes on the process here and goes and tells the wine stewards, just do what he says. And so they fill up the jugs with water, they pour it. Not only do they have wine, but it's better wine than they've been serving, because normally they wait until everybody's half plastered and then they bring out the rotten stuff and nobody really cares, right? Well, so the story has a lot of twists in it, but what it's designed to do as one of these signs is to bring about that there is a certain amount of, or there is an understanding of Jesus that we now have to take in. That he's bringing about things that we haven't seen before. And that rather than in the synoptics of, I'm doing this, don't tell anybody, this is broadcast as, look what he did, wow, this guy's really, really good. And it points out to, it begins to unfold the fact that Jesus is the Messiah. When we look at these signs, I think one of the things that we need to do is just keep in mind these are all trying to point us to the understanding of Jesus being the Messiah. John is trying to convince his Jewish audience that Jesus is the one they've been waiting for. And pushes that part. So that's the first sign that he has.
Did it take all 7 signs to convince them finally?
Probably some of them. I suppose that they're no different than we might be, that different people require different levels of convincing on something. Part of it may be personality. There are those that are willing to take a flyer on things sometimes that other people aren't.
And I think even today, unless you see it with your own eyes, are you going to believe somebody telling you something that's far-fetched?
And I think that becomes more and more the case than it was. In Jesus' time, there was a certain amount of, I don't want to say superstition, but they were more accepting of, they were less critical, if you will, of, they didn't, they took that in the beginning God made the heavens and the earth, and they were more apt to take that literally than generations later, who would read with a critical eye, might be willing to do, I think. But sometimes we require a lot of evidence in order to make a decision. Some people are better able to accept something right away, to act almost impulsively. You send 2 people to IKEA to buy a bookcase, and they come back. One person may say, I know how to put this together. The other person may spend days reading the instructions and highlighting and counting all the parts to make sure they're there before they are convinced that they should go ahead and do this. I
You've
think
done that, haven't you?
I'm the first guy. I'm the it's good enough guy. But it so much would seem to have to do with personality and that willingness to take a risk. Because when it comes to faith and our faith life, I sure don't want to be wrong. And there are times when we argue the faith that one of the reasons is because it's so important for us to be right. Not arrogant right, not, I'm going to tell you what to believe, but this is what I believe and I'm really banking heavily on it. And so if somebody comes along and challenges that, I'm gonna fight right back. Again, why do we have like a gazillion different Christian denominations? Well, because the faith was so important to people that when it came to issues they saw as being critical, they weren't willing to budge. And that's, I may find myself occasionally in the same boat as that. One of the areas where Jesus did not want to budge was in what comes up then in chapter 2, having the temple being used as a marketplace. Now, in John, this story about the turning over the tables in the temple comes at a different point in the story than it does in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where it comes in Holy Week and where it becomes the final straw that finally gets people to say, well, we're going to eliminate this guy. This comes very early in Jesus' ministry. In the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it pretty much looks like what we're following in Jesus' adulthood is a year in the life of Jesus. In John, it may be more like 2 or 3 years that we're moving through and covering. So, yeah, the timing just is off. The nature of the story itself is not. And that is, at the festivals in Jerusalem, especially where people needed to bring large sacrifices, it could be a real drag to have to drag your sacrifice several miles to get to the temple. So the temple authorities figured out a good way to deal with this was to make those sacrificial animals and make the money that you needed to pay the temple tax available on site. And it was a convenience, if you will, that people were willing to pay for. When we think of a convenience store, normally what we're thinking about, what's easy for me to do, and if it's easy enough, yeah, I'm willing to pay a little extra for it. I'm driving along and I've got a headache, and there's a Wawa, and I stop in and I buy 2 Tylenol in a little package. I'm going to pay a lot more for those 2 Tylenol than I would ever pay in a drugstore. But you know what? I'm in and out and back on my way, and that has value to me. It's the same concept. the fact is, people who did not have to drag a sheep or a goat several miles were able to make their trip a lot easier. What was the cost of that? Well, when they got there, they were going to pay a little more money to get their sacrifice, or they were going to pay a higher exchange rate in order to get the money for the temple tax. And people didn't see it as bad. I mean, I don't think we walk into a convenience store and expect that we're going to get the same prices that we get in a grocery store. And, you know, we don't have a conniption over it because we expect it. You know, if it just is what it is. If I want a Pop-Tart and I'm willing to wait in line in the grocery store, I'm going to get it cheaper than if I'm in and out of Valero or whatever it may be. But anyway, part of Jesus's concern seems to be not that they had this convenience service, but where they housed it. That maybe if they would have housed it somewhere outside of the temple grounds, as kind of like a flea market thing, it would be less objectionable. But the fact that it occurred in the temple courtyard itself just did not sit well.
Was this part of John's plan to present it this early in his writings versus what Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where they wrote theirs of the temple?
I think he probably wanted to set the scene that this was going to be a combative relationship, that Jesus was not there to fortify the status quo, that he was there as a change agent. And yeah, he establishes that real early. And, you know, from that, begins to create this animosity between himself and the Jewish leaders. Because obviously one of the things that happened in this setting up of the market in the temple courtyard was it was kind of like $15 a table kind of a deal of a flea market. The temple's making some money out of this too. It's not pure service, it's also a fundraiser. You know, how do we apply that today? You know, many of our churches do flea markets, bazaars, rummage sales, you name it. You know, it's not just for the pure purpose of providing a convenience for the people. If we come out of it and we don't make some coin, we're not necessarily thrilled that we put in all this effort. So how we look at that may be that what Jesus was seeing was not only was this the wrong use of temple space, but it was taking on too much of a life of its own. That when you allow something to be bigger, I'd love some, Jane. When you allow something to become bigger than the reason you exist, there's a problem. So, how do we look at that in the local church? And how do we filter that event in? A couple of weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, the sermon was on taking care of business. Well, what's our business? And we have the mission statement in Matthew 28 of basically evangelizing. So our mission, with all due respect, is not the Strawberry Festival. That's not the mission. That's part of carrying out the mission. It's not the mission in and of itself. The mission in and of itself is not simply to come together and eat. The mission's always driving a little bit beyond. And part of the concern perhaps that Jesus had here was that it was becoming the mission. The temple was making money, people were making money, it was convenient for people, it was quite a racket going on. They probably spent a lot of time and energy planning. There was probably some sort of temple sexton who had schematics drawing out where each table would be and you know how people would rotate among the tables. And there were people who said, I want that table because that's going to get more traffic than the table over here. And if you had two sheep salesmen there, they would probably, you know, want to compete for the better spot. And it just got out of control. And so Jesus gets out of control. They're a very wonderful and esteemed theologian, the late Walter Wink, often presented Jesus as an example of nonviolent resistance, oftentimes looking at the Passion Week situation, where when they came looking for him, he basically said, "Here I am," type of thing. I had the real privilege of getting to know Walter because when I was at Kirkridge, he came and did retreats. And we talked about this passage because, and to this day, I still see it as being a somewhat violent act. You know, and he disagreed with me, and quite frankly, he's better than I am, so. But there's a certain amount that everybody who had an investment in these religious festivals tended to be in agreement that this was okay. It was only Jesus who had the objection. The temple authorities didn't object. The Roman government didn't object. The people who came and made use of the services didn't object. So it was a one-man revolt against something that everybody else was seeing okay. And how do we accept when Jesus comes along in our life and challenges stuff that we always thought was okay? You know, is the gospel is not always designed to affirm us for who we are. The gospel is to challenge us into being who God wants us to And there are times then that means that who we are when Jesus approaches is going to cause a confrontation, not a group hug. And we have to figure out what we do with this. I would venture to say that in this temple, the vendors, very few of them, if any, thought they were doing anything wrong at all. They just thought they were doing their, this is an opportunity. It's kind of like when we go to annual conference and Cokesbury has a book display. Well, they're not there just to edify me and offer me resources so that I can be a better Christian. They're not giving me stuff, they're selling me stuff, and they're trying to make a profit. They don't see anything wrong with it. I don't see anything wrong with it. If I were back in Jesus' time, would I see anything wrong with this? Maybe not. I might just see Jesus as being a little bit over the top.
I wonder what kind of grade he would give our churches, including ourselves, if he would view the Strawberry Festival and the pasty making and rummy sales.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. One that perhaps we should always be asking of anything. How does this support the mission that we've been called to? Now, it may very well be, we can always make those connections. What would be negative is when we try to avoid making any connections. That what we're doing is a standalone thing designed for a purpose totally other than carrying out the mission.
You could look at those things, such as the Strawberry Festival and the rummage sale, as reaching out to the public, making them aware of the church and the church's doings, and then you take that money and you put it into the church budget and into plus all the way around. Now, if you would take that money and divvy it up between everybody, that's a different story. Didn't think of that one, did you?
And I think personally, it's those kind of connections that we want to be able to speak out and be able to say, this is how it connects. I think there are times in the life of the church where maybe when something started, it was because it connected to the mission, but then it takes a life of itself and the mission is lost. So, in some churches where they do a year of planned action, for example, everything is called into question of how does this support our mission? Because we've always done it that way does not support the mission. But most things can be tied into the mission, even if it is, well, this provides financial support for us carrying out a larger purpose.
The first thing you could say when somebody asked is our community dinners that serve the community. That's our mission.
Yeah. And you just want to make sure that if a stranger came up to you and said, hey, what's this got to do with the church? That you could verbalize for them a rationale for why. If you say, I don't know,
No, that's the wrong
it's
answer.
not helpful. You know?
I think we all could visualize and spout out different ways that the money's going to be used. I mean, there's so many areas that we support that there would be a really long list.
And there may not be a right answer, but the The response is, we've thought about it. You know, we haven't just decided that it would be good for the church to open a widget factory. We thought it all out and said, by making widgets, we're going to be able to employ people, and as we employ people, we're going to be able to make a product that helps support the life of the church, and with each widget we send out, we're going to give a little copy of the Gospel of John and an invitation to the church, and it becomes evangelistic in nature, and we carry that through. Not just, we're making widgets because it's a way to make a couple of bucks. So that's basically chapter 2 in a nutshell. Who has words of wisdom on that? I think it's just, you know, something to try to embrace that story. One of the parts that we kind of missed was where Jesus talks about tearing down the temple and rebuilding it in 3 days. You know, which is, again, we're early in the gospel. It's already making an allusion to the death and resurrection. And to show how we might mistake things that are said. The Jews thought that he was actually talking about the temple and knocking that down and rebuilding it in 3 days. Now, one of the things that I've noticed on television commercials is jacuzzi. They install showers in a day, and I'm thinking, you know, that's impossible. And I, like the Jews, rebuild the temple in 3 days. That's impossible. Jacuzzi could do it in a day.
Hopefully he put it all on one floor. And
Yeah.
a lot of steps.
Do you think the overturning of the tables played a part in the minds of the people when they said, you know, crucify him, crucify him? You know, they just, he wasn't nice to overturn the tables,
Mhm.
you know.
You know, it sets up that relationship of animosity. If we had a visitor in church and within a week they started telling us what's wrong with the church, it doesn't sit well. Well, that's this, you know, tenfold. Not only does this not sit well, but I'm doing something about it, and you're not going to like it. Whenever the status quo is challenged, there's going to be a sense of animosity.
But you have to, you at that time, have to offer the alternatives to that challenge. You have to, immediately.
If not, you're just setting up a battle. You know, if somebody were to come along and say, I'm not really sure I understand why you're doing this, can you help me understand, is one thing. To, you're doing this all wrong, is an approach that's going to be less acceptable.
No, do you come back with, what would you suggest?
Well, you could, you know, if you entered into dialogue.
Oh,
Now Jesus didn't necessarily give the opportunity for dialogue here.
no, it didn't.
There wasn't a negotiation that went on. It was anger into action. It wasn't, well, I'll try to get the temple leaders to sit down and we can have a cordial discussion about this and see if we can reach some sort of middle ground that we can all accept.
Do you think he regretted?
Hmm?
Do you think he regretted doing that?
I don't know, that's a good question. You know,
Because that's the only time you ever hear of him getting.
Do rebels regret rebellious actions? I don't know.
If they get stuck in jail, maybe.
If they get stuck, maybe.
I think his love of God was so great that that was just such a violent, not that the settlers and the marketers were all violent, but in his eyes, that was such a, I can't think of
Like
the
a
word.
slap in the face.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes, and that was his natural response, was to,
One of my mother's acquaintances, who I never met but heard her stories of, was a man named Abby Hoffman. He was kind of a rebel back in the 60s.
Abby Hoffman?
Abby Hoffman.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I
And
said that.
I never heard her tell a story of him doing something that he later regretted. I heard her tell stories of other people who did things that they later regretted. And I'm sure that later in her life she told stories about me and things I did. But maybe if you're a rebel with a cause, you don't regret as much as if you're a rebel without a cause. You know, or are we rebellious because of a purpose, or are we rebellious because of a personality quirk?
Wouldn't you say in this case, Jesus' rebellion was for a very good
Good
cause?
purpose, yeah. And it may very well be that his anger was a strategic decision, not, I had a situation where I was consulting with a local church that was they were having issues with the pastor. And we're sitting around the table, and the pastor and the pastor's primary antagonists are just going at it. And, you know, they're not coming to any agreement. And it was a horrible night. I mean, it was the thunderstorms and all this kind of stuff. And finally, I sat there for a while and I said, should I do this? And I said, yeah. And I pounded on the table and said, am I wasting my night coming out in this horrible weather to deal with this? But I'd like to think it was it may not have been a good decision, but it was strategically done. It wasn't that I just exploded. I planned to explode.
There's a difference.
If anyone has ever picked a fight with a spouse, sometimes that fight starts well before the first words are fired.
It starts up here.
And it becomes a planned out verbal assault.
No, it comes with, I know I'm right and you're wrong.
That's right.
And usually I am wrong.
I didn't
But
say
you
that.
didn't need to point that out. I'm well aware of that.
But that's the thinking.
Yeah, the pre-planning of, I know I'm going to get into a divisive situation with this person or this thing. I'm planning now to launch my assault. It is a lot different than just exploding in the moment of seeing something and having an uncontrollable reaction. Now, there are times I want an uncontrollable reaction. If I see somebody getting ready to walk out into the middle of traffic, I'm going to grab them back. I'm not going to say, I wonder what my strategy should be here. You know, and the next thing you know, they're like a bug under the tire. You know, I do react. And I hope that my reactions are the right thing. But I know that there are times that I react that I shouldn't have. Where, you know, you're in an argument with a loved one, and halfway through your opening statements, you're thinking to yourself, boy, I made a terrible mistake.
Especially after you don't communicate for
Yes,
a
yes. As we, you know, having to be involved in Tom's and Sandy's trip back from Florida, where I had to serve as mediator for miles away. You know, so yeah, you know, I don't think Jesus had an uncontrolled response, because he is too deliberate for that to be part of his normal bag of tricks.
I never even thought of it that way. I'm glad that you said that. I thought it was a spur of the moment type thing, that he went in there and saw that and lost it.
Just keep in mind, I mean, that there are times that our strategy is to lose it. Okay? My cable goes out for the umpteenth time, and I'm calling astound. I'm planning on losing it, because I've about had it, right? And I'm thinking the only way you're going to understand where I'm coming from is if I seem out of control. Maybe a strategy. You know, it's not, oh, my cable went out again, but I fully understand.
You're not going to kill them with that.
Please take your time. Take care of other people first. More important. Well, next week we're going to cover Nicodemus in chapter 3, where Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night. And what we're going to try to do is trace the development of Nicodemus through the Gospel of John. So it will be both a look at chapter 3, but we'll be alluding to John moving beyond all of that. So I thank you for coming out this morning.
Thank you.
And please remember that if you do need to miss a week, it's okay. Don't feel as though perfect attendance is necessary in order to get something out of this study.
You don't get gold star? The next time you come in, I just exploded. Well, it's about time.